Welcome.
Thank you.
And Jim Johnson was saying that you're directly responsible for getting Naomi Campbell, and that's all I really want to know about. This is a time you were working for the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Put this all into context, you know?
Okay, now you're testing my memory, so I have to make sure I get the sequence at least approximately correct. But there's a part of the story I can't tell you, but we received information that during a dinner with Nelson Mandela that Charles Taylor had given a diamond to Naomi Campbell. So I began to try to contact Ms. Campbell through her agents and then eventually her lawyers without success. She wasn't willing to speak to me. But also in doing a little research on that dinner, I realized that Mia Farrow had been present. So doing a little Google search, I found a NGO that she was on the board of directors. I sent an email to the NGO explaining that I was a prosecutor on the Charles Taylor case and I would like the opportunity to speak to Ms. Farrow. And I got a response, I think within an hour, the same day, definitely. I got a response, "Hello, Nick, I'm happy to speak to you," and with her phone number, the home phone number of Ms. Farrow. So I called her up, and I remember that very distinctly. She was telling me, "Well, really, I'd love to help you. I really don't remember much about it. There was a dinner. Charles Taylor showed up, and really, there's not much. I didn't speak to him that much. I don't remember much about it, except I do remember the next morning, Naomi Campbell came downstairs and she said she got a huge diamond from Charles Taylor." And I said, "Just a second." Called in a couple of colleagues, put it on speakerphone. "Can you repeat that?" Yeah, I said, "Well, I just remember that Naomi Campbell came downstairs and she said she got a huge diamond from Charles Taylor." So that's how it started. And then eventually we received further corroboration when the agent for Naomi Campbell contacted us through her lawyer, explaining that she actually was present when the diamond was delivered, and diamonds were delivered. She explained it was several diamonds. So that's how it did transpire, that we ended up then seeking a court order to have Naomi Campbell appear. And that was granted, and she appeared along with the agent, Carol White, and Mia Farrow.
Every time I have Jim Johnson, at a conference, I said, "Jim, here he is, chief of prosecutions, all this other resume stuff. Tell everybody about Naomi Campbell, because that's the sex appeal." Did you find that to be in the case itself, in the courtroom, when she was when the word got out that she was going to testify?
Well, it by far was the moment where there was the most interest in the court. And I recall on that day, I think there were 5 satellite trucks outside the court, which we didn't have at other moments. So it certainly was special in that way as far as the coverage. It wasn't, the moment where we thought it was the most key evidence. It clearly was relevant. Charles Taylor had denied ever having a diamond ever in his possession other than a jewelry. This was a rough diamond, unpolished diamond. So it went directly to his credibility. It's rather complicated, but on that particular trip, Taylor later went to Burkina Faso and Libya, and 2 weeks later a huge arms shipment came from Libya through Burkina Faso to the rebels in Sierra Leone. So the fact that he was carrying rough diamonds on that trip was very relevant. But yeah, it was unusual to get all the coverage, and while many people found that easy to criticize, and that wasn't our fault. Frankly, if Charles Taylor had given the diamond to the hotel maid, we would have subpoenaed the hotel maid.
So it was kind of fun to have Naomi there. Did any of your family members, I hate to focus just on that because there's so much to it, but it certainly caught our attention, it caught the national attention. And did Brenda feel that this was important to kind of bring the case back to the national spotlight?
I don't think that really was our objective at all in calling her. I mean, obviously we realized it did. It got a lot of interest, and people who knew nothing about Sierra Leone and Liberia and all the hands being chopped off and the role of diamonds in the conflict became aware of it because of that press coverage of Naomi Campbell coming to the court. But that really never was our objective.
Yeah, just a nice an after effect. Were you destined to be in this world of international criminal law?
It definitely wasn't destined. It's one of those things where life can take funny turns. But an opportunity arose. I applied, I think, a couple times on the internet. I always was interested in international affairs, and I was been a prosecutor for 20 years before I went into the field. So when I got the opportunity to work at the Yugoslav Tribunal, I, of course, immediately agreed, even with a substantial pay cut, I guess. But I imagined, like many people, when I went, I'm going for 2 years, and that's 14 years ago.
So, just to draw me back, where you from originally?
Well, I was born in Arizona, grew up in New Jersey, and then I practiced law for my entire career in Los Angeles. So I was a prosecutor for 20 years at the LA DA's office before going to the Yugoslav Tribunal.
What time period were you at the LAPD?
I was in there, I graduated in 79. I worked in a federal office, energy department for a year, 81 to 2000.
Were you there during the whole Simpson trial?
Actually, those years, I happened to be on a leave of absence. I was in the U.S. Foreign Service.
Yeah.
So I missed that trial.
Probably just as well,
Yeah.
Then, literally, there's an aha moment where you say, all right, I want to do something different. I mean, was there somebody who contacted you? Was there somebody?
No, I just applied over the internet.
Okay.
But, I knew I always was interested in doing something different. And I had done different things. I'd done volunteer work abroad with the American Bar Association in Armenia, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Montenegro, between 1 and 4 months in each of those. And I had been in the Foreign Service briefly. I was based in Argentina. So I always had this international bug.
Are you Armenian?
Yes.
How do you pronounce your last name?
Well, there's various pronunciations.
I've heard them all. That's why I got to ask you.
Koumijian.
Koumijian? Okay. The Armenian genocide, is that part of your research and interest?
Certainly I'm interested in it. And my father was Armenian. My mother was not. But yes, my father's family lived through the genocide. They actually fled Armenia in 1922. And my father was very young when he left. What's clear to me, because I think he would have no trouble at all speaking of his experiences, was that his parents didn't tell him much about what happened to them. And it's very obvious to me now, looking back. My grandparents died when I was quite young, so I had never asked them about their experience, and they never spoke English very well either. But clearly, I've heard some stories from my uncles and aunts. It affected them, and they were very fortunate to survive, particularly the area they were from. There was both a massacre in 1910 in Adana, and then the genocide.
Is enough being done to recognize that? I know Turkey just can't quite officially acknowledge that.
Well, I think that there are many voices in Turkey now that are recognizing that it's important for Turkey itself to come to terms with its history. I believe in that. I believe that in the United States, for example, we would not be a stronger country if we denied that we had slavery. Mm-hmm. Acknowledging it and dealing with it makes the country stronger. Facing the truth of the past, learning from it, is very important. So I do think that while things definitely have changed in the last 10, 20 years, there still is a ways to go, and I'm hopeful that eventually they'll reach that.
So track me through your life story here. You finally now enter into the international tribunal world, and your first assignment is?
I first went to the Yugoslav Tribunal in 2000 and worked on a case involving the region of...
Chief prosecutor at that time was?
It was
it
Carlo Del Ponte,
Yeah.
yes. So worked on a case involving Northwest Bosnia, and then again, sort of a little bit of what was fortunate for me is an opening happened on a smaller case, the mayor of Prijedor, which was a town where about 3,000 people were killed in 100 days. So I had a principal role in that trial, and it resulted in, at the time, the first life sentence, although that was later reduced and appealed to 42 years. So I was there for 3 years, and then got an opportunity to become the deputy, I forget the exact title, deputy prosecutor for serious crimes in East Timor, which made me the head of the UN unit that was prosecuting crimes against humanity and war crimes for the 1999 election violence in East Timor. So I was there from 2003 to 2005. 2005 to 6, I was in the State Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo. And then did a couple little bit different things. For 6 months, I was on an anti-corruption position in Kiev, in Ukraine, a regional position. And then I got a position as the head of a US-funded, USAID-funded human rights program in Colombia, which at the time was the largest human rights program the United States government funded. I was there, supposed to be there for 5 years, but after 8 months I heard there was an opportunity to work on the Charles Taylor trial, and just decided that that was really more my thing, and an opportunity I couldn't pass up. So I then left the Colombia and went to the Special Court for Sierra Leone, based in The Hague, just as the Taylor trial was about to begin.
This would have been Steve Rapp time period?
This would have been, Stephen Rapp had recently gotten there, so it was 2007.
Okay. 2 years ago, we had, all of them were here, as they're this today. Sat them down and did sort of the Charles Taylor chronology with all 4 of them at the Jackson Center, and it was really cool about that. And then you stayed there through the end?
Yes, I was there through the end, full-time, through the end of the trial, which I think was 2011 when we did our closing arguments. So after the closing arguments, I left, but then I came back for the appeal. Once we had a judgment, or just before the judgment, I came back as a consultant, but basically working full-time on the appeal, so did about another year or 10 months while we prepared our appeal submissions. And then I actually, of course, came back. I was no longer on the payroll, but came back for the judgment. And that was, I believe, the 28th of August. It was a Friday that we got the judgment on the Charles Taylor case. And on Monday, I was on the plane to Cambodia.
My gosh.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any surprise in the judgment? Did it go as you expected?
Well, I really, when those things happen, I refuse to speculate or predict, because what I have learned in law is you never can be 100% sure, and all these predictions and expectations don't really do you any good. So I felt that we had strong evidence in the case and had proven his guilt, and I was hopeful the judges would agree. So the judgment, I was pleased with it. I wouldn't say I was surprised, but I would hardly say that I wouldn't say either that that's what I expected, because you never know what to expect.
Yeah. When did they reach out to you, or did you reach out to them regarding the Cambodia position? How did that happen?
I think I was contacted by the UN in about 2008 to interview for that. So that's the kind of thing where someone gives a name, and various people were interviewed. And so I was appointed originally as the reserve prosecutor. So most of the time when I was working on Taylor, I was the reserve in Cambodia, which only has the responsibility then of attending plenaries when there is a plenary, which I think there were 2 or 3 before I went out as the prosecutor.
Now you're there, or will be there. When's the transition officially occur, or has it occurred?
No, I've been there since October 1st of 2013,
Okay.
so I'm approaching 1 year, although time passes very quickly, yes.
How have you found it's such a unique setup? And I guess for the camera, you might want to explain how it's set up because you're a co-prosecutor with a representative from the Cambodian government.
Right. So the court was set up by treaty between the United Nations and the Cambodian government, and there was a lot of negotiations about control of the court and the structure of the court, and the Cambodian government wanted it to be part of the Cambodian system. They wanted to have a Cambodian court with UN assistance. Eventually, various compromises were made, and one of those compromises was that there would be two prosecutors, a national and international prosecutor. There's also, this is a system very much like based on the French system of criminal procedure, where there's an investigative judge who does some of the role that in common law countries would be the prosecutor's role, investigating the case and actually making the charges. So the prosecutors send a request for investigation with suspects to the investigating judge, and then he then investigates and decides on the charges after taking submissions from both the prosecution and the defense. So the structure of the court as it was set up, there's both a national and international prosecutor, national and international co-investigating judge. But they put in a very special rule that in the case of disagreements between them, that it would then go to a pretrial chamber. And the pretrial chamber, like the trial chamber in the Supreme Court, is made up of a mix of Cambodian and international judges. For the chambers with 5, there's 2 internationals, 3 Cambodians. However, a decision can only be reached with a supermajority. So there have to be 4 judges to agree on any decision. If there's not 4 judges, then there's there's a non-decision. In the case of a disagreement between the prosecutors or the co-investigating judges, the rules specifically say there's a disagreement about whether to file charges or proceed with charges. Unless there's a supermajority of judges that say the case should stop, the case proceeds. So, those are the mechanisms. And I have, and I know Andrew had, a very good relationship with the national co-prosecutors. And in our office, we have Cambodian prosecutors who are very involved in the cases. Currently, we have a group of young prosecutors who are also very aware of, that there are certain experiences that they don't have. They're anxious to learn from the internationals, and it's working pretty well.
Not so long ago, I just the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, which is just the shortened frame, and one of the blogs said after 6 years, the court trying the perpetrators of one of the worst mass crimes in history is likely to end up with just 3 convictions. Was it all worth it? And I realize that's a rhetorical question, and I realize the complexity. As you kind of walking your way through this, and I think you just got a sentencing on the most recent trial, right?
Well, that's right. Currently, there's been 3 convictions. The head of the famous prison in Phnom Penh, S21 or Tuol Sleng, where about 16,000 people were tortured and killed, executed, was convicted a few years ago and on appeal given a life sentence. We just received a verdict on the first part of the trial of the 2 most senior leaders that remain alive. Khieu Samphan, who was the head of state, during Democratic Kampuchea, he wasn't the head of government, but the head of state, and then Nun Chia, who was called brother number 2 to Pol Pot. So those 2 were convicted, and in this first phase of the trial that we finished, they were convicted about events that happened early in the regime, mainly the forced evacuations of the population, millions of people from Phnom Penh, and then transferred from one zone to the other, and all of the killings and the deaths that occurred as a result of that, and one massacre that occurred during that period of former Lon Nol soldiers. Still remaining to be tried are the remaining charges against them, which include many more of the killings, all of the security centers, genocide of the Cham Muslim group in Cambodia and of the Vietnamese in Cambodia, the persecution of religion, Buddhism, forced marriage and rapes that occurred in the forced marriages. All that remains to be tried in the second case. So 3 convictions at this point may not sound at least to the author of that article, understandably, as a lot. This court started in 2006. The ICC started in 2002. They have 2 convictions to date. So, war crimes are slow. It's expensive. This court was clearly set up only to try the most senior leaders, as are most of the war crimes courts. There still are some other cases in investigation, but was it worth it? I would say that what is the alternative? To have done nothing? I think absolutely an effort had to be made and has to continue to be made to try to recognize what happened, to make a historical record and to make an example that those who commit the very worst atrocities will not enjoy impunity. So, in my view, we have to do this.
This particular article, again, it was mentioned the fact that it's necessary to comfort the relatives of the Khmer Rouge's victims. It also helped the Cambodians come to terms with this dreadful episode in their history, and that more than 100,000 Cambodians have attended the court hearings. Television channels wrap up with the news of the week. School curriculums now teach the Khmer Rouge era. I think those are all benefits from what has happened there.
Absolutely. Even some of I remember one of the critics of the court was on television, on CNN, just after the verdicts, and this person suffered greatly from the Khmer Rouge and is very articulately tells her story about what happened to her. Well, she was on the international news because of this court, because of the judgment. So, the court itself reminds people of what happened 35 years ago. But this is something that in Cambodia, yes, it's in the news every day. You don't get over something like this in a generation or 2 generations. You asked me earlier about the Armenian genocide. Next year will be the 100th anniversary. It's still one of the topics most discussed every day in Armenian press and in Armenian events and politics. So the dealing with it, showing that the justice system can deal with events of such a magnitude, I think it's absolutely essential. I think it does affect even Cambodia today. It doesn't mean that all problems are solved, but it's an example that the rule of law can deal with problems in people's lives. And it changes, I think, people's perceptions of their own society. Is there any possibility of justice or not?
You will be at the Jackson Center tonight, and in fact, they're going to lay a brick in your honor tonight, which is cool. And what does a Robert Jackson mean to you?
Well, I think that this again is another example. The Nuremberg is an example that the meaning of a court, the real benefits of a court dealing with such massive crimes, goes so far beyond the fate of the accused persons. Nuremberg is not about whether or not several men were hung and other top leaders were given time in jail. It was about most of the world that was affected by this war seeing that there was a process of recognition of suffering and of making people responsible, who were responsible for those crimes, holding them to account. So I think also what Justice Jackson said at the very beginning of that case is so true. It's not just important what we do, but that people see that this is the process, that this is a fair process. So I think that's the legacy that we hope to continue and build upon.
Speaking of legacy, many of the prosecutors who are here today are part of or were part of hybrid tribunals, special UN created tribunals, treaty tribunals, which will come to an end. With only the ICC, it's permanent. nature. What do you see as the legacy of just those types of tribunals? Do you see that ever happening again, given some of the criticism of cost, time, expense, the political will to do that? Is there a afterlife?
I think so. Obviously, the International Criminal Court was set up, and those that were at least party of the treaty, with the idea that this would be the court that would handle the problems all around the world. But especially as the court's developing, we see all of the obvious problems and limitations of that. The distance sometimes between where the crimes happened and where the court is centered. That obviously creates great problems with investigation, just the cost of sending people back and forth, and whether or not they really can understand the conflict, as well as when investigators are based and living in the country. Every conflict is going to have different dimensions as far as what number of persons that can and should be tried, the types of evidence, whether investigations can take place or not because of security, or how they're taking place. I definitely think that there's a role for international tribunals. I think there's probably going to be a role for mixed tribunals where you have cases taking place, like in the Cambodia model, in the country with the local judiciary participating, with international involvement, which guarantees, I think, to many observers inside the country and out, certain objectivity or certain guarantees of higher international standards. I think another success story of an international court was the state court in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where, again, it's completely within the domestic system, but for many years they had international prosecutors and judges participating. And well, every court, of course, there's going to be criticisms, and every judgment somebody's going to be unhappy with. It added credibility to those cases, to the process, and to the results. And I think, even talking to my Bosnian colleagues, it helped to raise the standards of the local judicial system. So there are many benefits to having an international tribunal. In some cases, it may make sense cost-wise to have it in the country as opposed to having it at the ICCs, and in others it won't. But I hope there is a future, and there will be situations where further international tribunals or hybrid tribunals are created. Certainly, the need has not gone down. We're seeing more and more conflicts and horrendous atrocities around the world. But what's changed in the last 20 years since the ICT1 and ICTR were set up is every conflict, it's part of the discussion now, is holding to account those responsible for war crimes. And this is a subtle distinction that, people sometimes get lost in the numbers of the very limited number of people who have been convicted, the many examples where people still remain enjoying impunity for their crimes. But in every conflict, whether you're talking about Syria, whether you're talking today about Gaza, you even talk about the shooting down of MH17, the plane over Ukraine, every discussion now includes a discussion of investigations and holding to account those responsible for violations of international law. That, I think, is reflected, has an effect not just in these discussions after the event, but in my mind, it probably is preventing crimes. That's something you never can measure. You can never prove a crime did not happen, because in people's minds there's the belief that there could be a mechanism to hold me to account. But I definitely believe that it is having an effect. And the one place where we can see it is in many of the modern militaries, particularly in the developed countries, the United States, for example. Wars are conducted now with a great input from the lawyers about what is or is not a legal target. And you see in Kosovo, even in '99, in the bombing, I understand that every single target that NATO went after, it had to be approved by two different lawyers, had to check off that this is a legitimate target. So international law is affecting how countries conduct wars, decisions about whether to give aid to various groups in a conflict to make sure that they're not committing war crimes or violations of human rights, or doing all we can to reduce that possibility. I believe international law is having a big effect on how these conflicts are being carried out, and though we can't prove it, my guess is that many, many thousands have been saved because of it.
As you investigate, and you've been involved, whether it's East Timor, whether it's in Sierra Leone, whether it's in Cambodia, tremendous atrocities, how do you keep your sense of humor?
Well, I mean, I think I also was a prosecutor for 20 years, and you just have to keep that a little bit separate. Yeah. But certainly there's many people with very good sense of humor in the field.
Well,
Yeah.
I applaud you, I salute you, and I've had a chance to meet several of your profession. Finally, and then I'll let you go running, but where do you see yourself 5-10 years from now?
That's a good question. I often ask myself that. I don't know. I just have faith that something interesting will come along. I'm looking forward to whatever it will be.
Yeah.
But I think there's many possibilities, and the world's a changing place.
This is great, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome
Thanks.
to Stapa.
Thank you very much.